So there's not much information in the public domain about Debbie Tucker Green's background. The main things that are known about her is that she's a British woman of immediate Jamaican heritage, and that she worked as a stage manager for 10 years before becoming a playwright. I think she did the Royal Court's directing training scheme, actually, and then she followed that on by starting to write plays, and she now writes and directs all of her own work. She doesn't give interviews on her work. She just says, well, actually, the work needs to stand for itself. I'll leave it up to you what you want to do with the work. She only gave a couple of interviews very, very early on in her career in which she kind of talked about the way that she kind of plays with language and what she wants kind of language to represent in her plays. But other than that, most of the critical discourse on her plays has come from scholars and academics and theatre critics as well. She first appeared in a very visible way in 2003. She had written some work before, but in 2003 she had 2 plays produced within a couple of months of each other at 2 venues in London. And these 2 plays, Dirty Butterfly and Born Bad, kind of brought her to great public attention as someone that we should look out for, someone that would potentially be significant. She had a distinctive voice, she had a playful, experimental writing style. Her plays were kind of quite different from much of the other black British work that was being produced at that time, which was much more within a social realist ilk, whereas her style was kind of thought to be experimental, exciting, and as it says there, one of the most stylistically innovative and politically engaged playwrights that work in Britain today. So when she announced herself with those 2 plays, critics immediately kind of recognised her as someone that we should pay attention to. One of these reasons also is because her work, in critics' views, kind of parallels quite nicely with some of the canonical or very well-known white British playwrights. So they talk about connections to Ibsen, to Sarah Kane and in-your-face theatre, the in-your-face theatre movement, to Harold Pinter, to Samuel Beckett and the kind of playful use of language, to Carol Churchill, to the kind of feminist politics of some of Carol Churchill's work, much of Carol Churchill's work. And Debbie Tucker Green, a lot of the discourse of Debbie Tucker Green kind of talks about the ways that she kind of critiques white Western feminism from a black transnational viewpoint. And then David Mamet, an American playwright. Many people would have said, and critics said, of Earthry that the second part of Earthry was kind of reminiscent of Oleanna. So I don't know if any of you know Oleanna and might want to make that parallel. So in a short time, I think Debbie Tucker Green has become probably the most widely written about black British playwright, contemporary, that we had because of the seemingly recognisable traits in her work. And one of the things I've been thinking about in relation to her work is a kind of question around the portrayal of universal themes. So a lot of black playwrights, when they produce their work, and they want to think about how their work is going to sell to mainstream venues, they'll say things like, well, you know, it's about family relationships, it's about universal things. Anyone can go and see this play, and anyone can tune into what's happening in this play. And even when I was looking up Earthry and I found an interview with some of the cast, they were like, well, anyone can come to this play, anyone can arrive and tune into something of this play. There's no one that would come to this play and not find something to attach themselves to. And I've become quite interested in this idea of black plays as universal. I've even said it myself in some of my work around black playwriting, and I'm just starting to question now whether this is a useful way of thinking about black work, or whether we should be more recognising the ways in which black work is looking at black-specific and race-specific issues. I think there's an interesting tension in Debbie Tucker Green's work in terms of this question around universalism or race-specific work. I guess now I would prefer to argue that she addresses black issues, but in ways that are shaped with the knowledge that her plays will be performed at venues like the Royal Court to predominantly white audiences, and therefore she presents black issues or black experiences as human rights experiences. So rather than thinking about them in terms of universalism, I would think about them as a kind of black work as black experiences as human. So she humanises black experiences. And she does this through, for example, portraying themes like grief, using family dynamics in her work, and then, as it's listed there, this thing of kind of naming the characters through identities that are recognisable to most audiences. So the last kind of contextual thing in terms of her work is to think about 2003. 2003 was a really important year for black British playwriting. There were an unprecedented 11 black British plays produced during this year. And they were produced at kind of mainstream venues, so venues like the Royal Court, the Young Vic, Soho Theatre, the Hampstead, venues like that. And people were celebrating. They were like, oh my God, we have got 11 black plays. This is fantastic. It's a cultural renaissance. It's comparable to the Harlem Renaissance. Isn't this a fantastic moment? During that year, there were the 2 Debbie Tucker Green plays. There was Kwame Kwama's Elmina's Kitchen at the National Theatre, which later transferred to the West End. And there was Roy Williams's Fallout at the Royal Court, and there were several other plays. People celebrated. I celebrated until years later when I thought 11 black plays. 11 plays out of the total number of plays that were produced in that year was not very many. But added to this, of the several black plays that were produced, probably 75% of them were dealing with kind of urban dislocation and urban issues surrounding young black men. So in a way, kind of dealing with stereotypical ideas about black masculinity. And this is something that I would argue could be a way of kind of problematizing or critiquing the celebratory stance of much of the critics. What is interesting in terms of Debbie Tucker Green's work and the black playwrights at that time is that they were kind of moving beyond identity politics. So much of the work in the 80s and 90s had looked explicitly at race, at gender, at sexuality. And in the 2000s, these plays have started to attach onto much more issues of local and global importance. And then the last point on the PowerPoint is really around kind of most of the plays were written in a social realist form. And Debbie Tucker Green is interesting because she broke with that social realist form. So Alex is going to talk now about the Royal Court, which is where several of Debbie Tucker Green's plays have been played.
Yeah, so the Royal Court Theatre. You should all go to the Royal Court Theatre at some time. If not to see a play, then to go and see the fantastic selection of plays they've got upstairs. Great to browse, get some ideas from. So it opened originally in 1888 as the New Court Theatre. So the New Court Theatre closed in 1940 because of bombs in the Second World War. Later reopened as the home of George Devine's English Stage Company in 1952, and from then on it sort of became a site that championed new writing in British theatre. So big social realist plays like John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, Arnold Wesker's plays were staged there. Loads of big names in British playwriting have had their early careers bolstered by their work at the Royal Court and have continued to go there. Carol Churchill, several of her early plays were staged there, for example. People like Martin McDonagh, Sarah Daniels, Timberlake Wertenbaker, Roy Williams. Lots of names have passed through these doors, essentially. The current artistic director is Vicky Featherstone, who's the first female artist director of the theatre. And Debbie Tucker Green has done 6 plays here to date, the first of which was Stoning Mary, back in 2005. Stoning Mary was similar in some ways to Sarah Kane's Blasted, where Sarah Kane in that play was sort of locating the conflict going on in Yugoslavia to a hotel room in Leeds. Similarly, in Stoning Mary, what Debbie Tucker Green does is theatricalise things like child soldiers, civil wars going on essentially on the African continent, and she casts these parts with white actors, basically putting on stage the question, if this happens here, how would you react? Then we get Random in 2008 about, it's performed by one black female performer, sort of giving the lines of different characters around a random killing of a school student. Then we have Truth and Reconciliation, which looks at the aftermath of violence and things like genocide, and sort of holding accountable those events. We had Hang in 2015. I've got one of the images there on the top right there for Hang. Hang is about a black woman who is basically faced the choice of how she wants to basically murder someone who has done a very large wrong on her. And then, I've not actually noted this one here, but in 2017 she also had a profoundly affectionate devotion to someone, brackets noun, great title, which is about a few different couples and the failures of communication relationships. So a lot of the time in Debbie Tucker Green's work you get problems of words, essentially, which is one of the big themes going through there. And also what is notable about Debbie Tucker Green putting on shows at the Royal Court is that Sloane Square is a very sort of affluent area. Lots of the audiences, although we can't really generalise everyone, lots of the people who go to the Royal Court are sort of upper middle class, liberal. They're going for a sort of slice of political theatre. You could almost criticise it for people getting a quota of like acedia or different side of life in a sort of anaesthetised way. So it's always important to think about who's watching the play when you're putting on a play like Stoning Mary or Ear for Eye, who's actually there watching and sort of internalising what you're putting on stage.